Are You Experienced, released in 1967, is the debut album by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Very few artists have burst onto the scene in such a dramatic and captivating way, with the virtuoso and completely unique style of Jimi, backed by the incredible musicianship of Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums. The band didn't politely knock their way into rock folklore. They smashed the door in metaphorically, and a good few guitars quite literally. In the words of Jeff Beck, it was like a bomb going off, but in exactly the right place. The story begins with Chas Chandler, ex-bass player with the Animals, who had a switch of career, becoming a talent scout, manager and record producer. During his final tour with the Animals, Chandler saw a then unknown Jimi Hendrix playing a New York City nightclub. Roadie for the Animals, James Tappy Wright, said, "This guy didn't seem like anything special. Then all of a sudden, he started playing with his teeth. People were saying, 'What the hell?' And Chas thought, I could do something with this kid." Promising an introduction to his hero Eric Clapton, he soon convinced the 23-year-old to go over to the UK and accept him as his manager. Shortly after Jimi arrived in London in 1966, Noel Redding became the first member of his yet-to-be-named band. Previously, Noel had been a lead guitarist and had recently auditioned for the Animals. Redding agreed to try playing bass, and on September 29, 1966, after jamming on Hey Joe and Have Mercy on Me Baby, Jimi invited Noel to join the band. Chandler then helped Noel learn the bass, and sometimes Jimi showed him the parts he wanted. From 65 to late 66, Mitch Mitchell played with Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames, and literally the day after leaving the Blue Flames, Chandler invited Mitchell to audition for their new band. With Mitchell and Noel joining Jimi, the Experience was born. Are You Experienced was recorded in multiple sessions over 5 months, from October 1966 to April 67, at 3 London locations, Delane Lear, CBS and Olympic Studios. They only actually needed 10 days though within that 5-month period, thanks to Chandler's thriftiness, so in the end it cost just £1,500. They managed to do quite a lot of work on the backing tracks at Delane Lear, but they were receiving noise complaints from the neighbours due to the sheer volume in which they played at. Chandler said, "Hendrix liked to play loud, so loud in fact that it was causing things in the studio to rattle and shake. Jimi threw a tantrum because I wouldn't let him play guitar loud enough. He was playing a Marshall Twin Stack, and it was so loud in the studio that we were picking up various rattles and noises. Hendrix reportedly threatened to leave after being told to turn down, so Chandler called his bluff and gave him his immigration papers and passport. Fortunately though, he never went ahead with his threat. So they moved on to Olympic Studios to continue working on the album, and this is where they started working with Eddie Kramer, who would go on to work on much of Jimi's music over the years. Kramer remembers, "The new Olympic Studios in Barnes had just opened up, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience were one of the first clients. It was brand new, and it was the hippest recording studio in the UK, if not all the world. The Helios mixing console we had was like nothing else around. Jimi was very shy when he first came into the studio. He just sat quietly in the corner and waited for the amps to arrive. He didn't say much until the amps were situated and the drums were set up. Then he plugged in, and we were off to the races. We were recording on 4-track tape back then, and it was quite a process. You'd cut your initial basic 4 tracks, and then you'd have to mix them down in stereo and transfer it to another 4-track machine. You'd fill up 2 free tracks and mix all that back down to the first machine. There was a lot of bouncing back and forth. We were lucky to get what we got, especially as the budget was so tight back then. There was no time to mess around, and Jimi was very disciplined. The album's title song is a perfect case in point. There are a lot of backwards tape tracks on that one, drums, bass and guitar. We cut basic tracks and then flipped the tape over. At the end of the session, I made Jimi a copy of the backwards tracks. He went home and rehearsed all night to figure out what the guitar was going to do. He came in the next day and said, "Okay, roll the tape from this point." We figured out how it was going to sound backwards. It was brilliant that way. One of the most memorable songs, The Wind Cries Mary, was recorded in a single take with no rehearsals. Then Hendrix added several guitar overdubs. Chandler estimates they spent a total of 20 minutes on the song, and he'd only written it the night before. When Jimi arrived in the UK in September 66, he was playing a guitar lent to him by Linda Keith, girlfriend at the time of Keith Richards. This was a 1963 Olympic white Stratocaster with rosewood fretboard. On October 23rd, he recorded their rendition of Hey Joe with it. It's believed that it was stolen at a gig at the Roundhouse in the middle of recording in February 67, but by then he had acquired a few more Strats. He bought a black one, again with rosewood fretboard, which was also stolen, this time at a gig in Darlington, although apparently he said it was a dog anyway and wasn't that keen on it. He then bought a Sunburst and another white one. It's unclear which guitars he used for different songs due to the recording dates being so spread out, but his propensity to break his instruments did lead to some issues at times. Engineer Roger Mayer recalls a time when this led to an unlikely replacement. Hendrix broke his main Strat and had to borrow a guitar for a recording session he had the next morning. He only had one guitar at the gig, the Strat he was using, and he'd just broken it. So on the way to Olympic, we had to dispatch Noel Redding to get another one. Redding showed up at the studio with a regular butterscotch blonde Telecaster. I think it belonged to a friend of Noel's that he used to play with. That was the only guitar we could get. The Purple Haze solos were played on the upper part of the neck, and Jimmy wasn't intending to use a vibrato, so it didn't really matter that it was a Telecaster. Plus, with the effects Jimmy was using, it would have been impossible to tell the difference. Inspired by Clapton, Jimmy went out and bought two 100-watt JTM 45 Marshall heads prior to recording. These replaced his 30-watt Burns amps that Chandler had acquired for him. Foxy Lady was recorded at CBS Studios in London. Engineer there, Mike Ross, remembers. Jimmy came in with 4 Marshall cabs, which I couldn't believe. How was I to mic all this? Jimmy told me to stick a microphone 8 feet away from the cabs, and it would sound great. He actually showed me where to place the microphone, and I put a U67 valve mic where he instructed me to. Kramer said that at Olympic, he generally used either a Neumann U67 or a Bayer M160, or a combination of both. It might be slightly different, of course, but the basic principle's the same: a ribbon and a condenser, along with some compression and EQ and reverb. All that stuff was always added during the recording. Jimmy's, of course, famous for his use of effects to create what was then a unique sound, and this really was the early days when it came to the equipment available to do it. So much so that the wah effect on Don't Live Today wasn't a Vox wah that it would use later on, but a device controlled by hand with a foot-controlled version yet to be popularised. The arbiter fuzz face can be heard prominently on Love or Confusion, and this would be an effect he would use quite often. And later on in his career, Roger Mayer made several modifications to his fuzz faces to achieve specific sounds, but these modified pedals still looked exactly the same as the standard fuzz. A lot of these modded fuzz faces were stolen from shows, and nobody knows where they ended up. Hendrix met Roger Mayer soon after arriving in England, and they remained friends thereafter. Jimmy recorded Purple Haze and Fire using one of Mayer's own creations, the Octavia pedal, which went on to become a big part of his sound. When Track Records sent the master tapes of Purple Haze for mastering, they allegedly wrote on the tape box, "Deliberate distortion, do not correct." Chandler explained how Jimmy was very unsure of his own voice on the initial sessions. Unsure of his inner ability, Hendrix was nervous of messing up the recordings. Jimmy was paranoid about his voice from the very first day I met him, remembered Chandler. From my first day in the studio with him to my last, he would always want his voice buried, and I'd want to place it more forward in the mix. By January '67, they'd already released Hey Joe, Purple Haze, and The Wind Cries Mary, with the album itself released on the 12th of May. It was a commercial and critical success, and within 7 months it sold more than 1 million copies. Are You Experienced stayed on the UK charts for 33 weeks, and was still there when they released their second album, Axis Boulder's Love, on the 1st of December 1967. The album also spent 70 weeks on the American R&B charts. It's considered one of the most important rock records of all time, and it regularly appears high on the best ever albums list. In 2005, it was also one of the 50 recordings chosen by the Library of Congress to be added to the National Recording Registry in recognition of its cultural significance. Its influence is far-reaching, and it must be considered one of the greatest debut albums of all time.